laying here connected to my circuit, it led me to believe that this is actually a charging device, and my body contains the battery that I'm charging. The belly button and whatever other point, right now I'm using the shoulder point along the spine between the shoulder blades. I thought it should be the tailbone, but I could be wrong. But the silver that I eat, embedded in beeswax shavings, is like the plates and the electrolyte in a sense, because the beeswax is kind of like, well, beeswax being a dielectric, it's kind of like an electrolyte in a sense, because the water of a battery, of course, is a dielectric, but then it has lead compounds in there, and that's what I have. I've got silver compounds. So in a sense, this is kind of like a potential combination of both plates and electrolyte of a battery, because the silver is eventually going to come off the beeswax and move elsewhere, aside from the beeswax, which will eventually move out the system. A lot of the silver is going to leave the system, but some of it's going to pass through the gut and go through the system because it's being charged with electricity. And when I think about ozone and hydrogen peroxide are opposite net charges, ozone being positive, hydrogen peroxide being negative, in a sense, this represents those two oxidizers because it represents the dipole, in which ozone represented by a positive charge, hydrogen peroxide by a negative charge. Although normally I only use one, hydrogen peroxide, but I think it's to offset the fact that my body produces ozone, right? It produces oxidants and oxidation. Now, hydrogen peroxide is an oxidant, but we forget that there's charge polarity possible. When we say an ozone is ruthless in its ability to destroy the physiology, we forget that it does so not because it's an oxidizer. Hydrogen peroxide isn't ruthless, it's a healer. So its ruthless is that it's the wrong charge. It's positive. Ozone is positive, and all of the things that we try to be antioxidant against, the use of vitamin C and vitamin E, we have the wrong enemy. We have the enemy tagged wrong. It's not because it's an oxidizer, it's because it's a positive charge. That is, the enemy is the positive charge itself, not the oxidizers that we talk about, because hydrogen peroxide is an oxidizer, but it's negative, and it's life-enhancing. It will eliminate depression. So obviously we're screwed. We're screwed up in how we deal with a problem. We don't even define it properly. Now, when you're dealing with a dipole in which the current is suppressed, so this is a charging device, except there's no current. Normally we think when we charge a battery, we do the opposite. Yeah, we have to have a certain amount of operational voltage to be able to charge the battery pack in our electric car, for instance. But most importantly are the amp hours that we're feeding in, and the amp hours that are going to be stored in those batteries. So ultimately it's current, and current is a limiter. When the batteries are empty, there's only so much current we can put in there, and when the batteries are full, even less so. But when the batteries are somewhere in the middle, we can really chug that current in there at full throttle, with certain limits, relatively speaking. So we focus on current, but here it's the opposite methodology. Kind of like Voltrolysis of Stanley Meyer's later development of splitting water, as opposed to the earlier. Instead of brute force current, use resonance of frequency, pulsed voltage, without current. Well, here there's no pulses, there's no frequency, and there's no current, just continuous DC voltage, because I go to the trouble of putting 6.6 gigaohms of resistance, so of course I'm not going to have any current to speak of. When we're talking about a couple hundred picoamps, it's all about voltage. That's what Becker never emphasized. He emphasized polarity, and he emphasized the need to bring down the amperage, but the consequence is that amperage is not your focus, voltage is your focus. And so voltage is what you're creating when you're helping the healing process. So the body does have a battery hookup, and at the moment I'm choosing to use a point between the shoulder blades for my positive lead and my belly button for the negative lead. But there are a lot of different hookup points, and I guess like anything else, you have to pick which one is suitable for you at that given moment in time. Just like I have to pick which mineral salt to put in the bath. I don't pick the silver hydroperoxide, that's stable. I don't pick the MSM, I just make sure I get high quality. That's stable in terms of my ingredient list for the recipe of the bath. The only thing that varies is the singular bath salt that I put in, and right now I'm hung on baking soda as being the best choice for me. So that varies. So we get a protocol out of Becker that's partly variable and partly constant and doesn't change. For instance, this is a suppressed amperage, but I'm very underweight. If I was overweight, this wouldn't work for somebody overweight, and they would have to be more mindful where they put the contacts on the body, that they don't damage something if they bring up the amperage. But they might not get any benefits, any noticeable benefits if they don't bring up the amperage. And maybe 1 to 3 microamps is the limit, the upper limit. I don't know what the lower limit is, if there is one. Quite frankly, I don't think there is one. Yeah, the more you depress it, the amperage, in my case, the more blissful it is. So I don't know if there is a lower limit for somebody like me who's frail. And electrically speaking, I am. And that's why I'm underweight, because my system is not running. You know, he called his book for a reason, Dr. Robert O. Becker, The Body Electric. Because it is. It's just a semiconductor. It's not an electrolytic battery. It's not a conductive wire. It's a semiconductor, an intelligent one at that, which can change its semiconductance at the drop of a hat. Every single cell is like a little bit among the millions or billions of bits on a computer chip, and each cell can change its resistance at the drop of a hat and gate the flow of energy on or off within the physiology. So it's quite interesting the way the physiology works, the way Becker discovered it to be. Medicine just gave up trying to figure it out because they only tried 2 concepts, 2 paradigms. The conductive piece of wire and the electrolytic solution in a battery. They couldn't think of a semiconductor, and they've never gone back to the topic, like Becker did, to consider introducing a third hypothesis to see if it fits, and he found that it does. And that's why everybody says he's theory, and which is a loose way of saying bogwash, not believable, because they don't understand that fundamental principle that he came up with, that the body is a semiconductor. It's a computer chip, but a very complicated one, a very big one, and that's how it operates electrically. So, by putting silver in my gut, along with the dielectric beeswax, I'm doing something very interesting that I don't fully understand, but I'm beginning to appreciate that it's very fundamental. Oil and salt is just a means to get in more, but who says you have to have more? That's, relative to circumstance. So, in terms of moderation, it's sufficient. It doesn't need oil and salt. Beeswax and silver is good enough. But the missing ingredient wasn't salt and oil, it was voltage. Not current, but voltage. And the variety of trying out new positions of where to put the electrodes. What axis of orientation, front to back, top to bottom, or left to right, and what polarity. And more specifically, where on the surface of the body, because we get a lot of choices. Just the front and back side of the body are a tremendous amount of choices. that affect both the top and bottom axis as well as the front and back axis. The side to side, well, that too. The arms, the shoulders, the legs. So have yet to put these contacts on the side of my body. I usually put them on the front or the back, sometimes on the bottom of the feet, sometimes on the hands, the palms of the hands. So all of those have to do with those three axes of front to back, front versus back, top versus bottom, and left versus right. Even though we don't put anything on the sides of the body, oddly enough, because I don't know if it would be necessary. It might be if you had a sciatica or a hip problem. Maybe it would be advantageous to put one of the electrodes over the hip joint, or if you have arthritis, to help melt the arthritis. And I would imagine it would be the positive lead that you would put over an arthritic joint, I would imagine, because it's an inflammation. And just like cancer is a blowing up or a growth, just like behaving very parallel to an inflammatory joint, I would imagine that positive is what you would want to shut that down, to shut down the inflammation, just like you would want to shut down cancer. I have verified that the little growth on my backside is where I put a positive lead about 1.5 years ago when I was doing experiments. But I had a higher amperage, so I could blame it on the amperage, not on the fact that I've done this before. And I could blame it on Becker not following his original research of picoamps when it came time to treat and experiment people and animals. He used something other than his original data would indicate. He used nanoamps or even 1 or 2 microamps instead of a few hundred picoamps. So I don't understand. I don't know. Nowhere in the book does he give even the slightest hint why he did not use the original low level of picoamps. I have no idea. But, and I've read through his patents. So I haven't read all his scientific journal publications. In fact, very few. So maybe it's hidden somewhere in there. And wherever it's hidden, or maybe he never covered it. Maybe he doesn't know it either. I don't know. Or maybe he just didn't share it with us. Obviously, he had to have a reason. Maybe he thought picoamps was appropriate for a salamander, but inappropriate for everybody else, including lab rats. So I don't know. Who knows? At any rate, for me, I must have the sensitivity of a salamander, in which I have to go down to picoamps. I don't have a choice. And the bliss I get out of it is actually something might only be capable of a sensitive nervous system. So I could say, yeah, I'm frail and I'm underweight, but I can flip it the other way and say, well, but I get to experience bliss by attenuating, by reducing the brute force element of electricity, namely the current, and keeping the voltage moderate, 1.5 volts, and just bringing down the amperage more and more until, or I should say less and less, until I actually start to enjoy it. I used to notice it when I had it down to 16 or so, 10, let's say 10 nanoamps, because this is all hypothetical. I don't have a meter to measure 10 nanoamps. So I figured that if I went lower than 10 nanoamps, it might even get better. But I never took the trouble to make a circuit with 6.6 gigohms of resistance until now, and that was 1.5 years ago. So it does pay, in my case, to reduce the amperage even further than what Becker did in practice, even though the very first practice he did, it wasn't a practice actually, it was a diagnosis. He was diagnosing the amperage by way of inference of a salamander undergoing healing when he broke its arm, and it registered picoamps of current. It was what he computed based on the magnetic field that the broken arm during healing was producing in his very expensive device that he could have only have gotten either on loan or rental or purchase if it had, because of the grant money that he had for a limited duration. So we can thank his good fortune for staying goody two-shoes for a little while, before he lost his funding and came out and spoke against AC Fields. Because we wouldn't have had all his research had it not started with that little salamander experiment with that very fancy, expensive piece of equipment. So we can thank the relationship, the good terms relationship that he had with his government funding source for the limited duration that he had it. It shows how lacking in consciousness we have collectively because he's been buried. His research has been buried by being trivialized, by being a waste of time to put attention on. So I'm finding there are things that he didn't talk about that are necessary to know about, and you don't know until you get in and dirty your fingers and get into his research and do it. And since I don't have lab rats, I have only me, then that's how I find out. I'm making all my successes and my failures on me. And I get to say, well, I learned, and I get to own the knowledge, even though it may not be owned by anybody else, or maybe only a handful of people. But that's the only way, is to own it, by doing it. It's the only way. So this was my latest update from what I'm trying to gather, because I've never eaten silver in this quantity before. And it's very efficient. Once I go to the trouble to make silver shavings, beeswax shavings, it pays for itself. All I have to do is eat it with food, and it'll be less likely to stick to my teeth. Oranges works pretty good. Dried fruit works pretty good. A little nut butter. It goes good with that kind of a meal. Probably a lot better than any other kind of meal, although I don't know, maybe it would go good with meat. It does not seem to go good with starches, simply because it doesn't chew up very well. The salivation in the mouth doesn't work eating starchy grains and beans and eating beeswax along with it. So it seems to go better with other foods, other than starchy foods, which is fine by me, you know. I don't have to have it with every meal, maybe. I don't know. But the complement to eating silver in this large quantity may not be bathing in silver hydroperoxide. Because this, I've been saying all along, is the alternative to hydrogen peroxide to prevent argyria. So, this is the alternate complementation to this. The alternate complementation to actually bathing to complement this, the eating of silver. The bathing in hydrogen peroxide to prevent argyria, which simply indicates that we are metabolizing our silver. When we avoid argyria, we're metabolizing silver that has been ingested. And that's all the lack of argyria indicates. Or in other words, the presence of argyria means we're consuming silver but we're not using it. And we're wasting our time continuing to consume it. So running a moderate voltage depressed amperage of one kind or another circuit through the body helps the body utilize silver, but then bathing in hydrogen peroxide or silver hydroperoxide with MSM also helps the body utilize silver. Either way, we get two alternates to help us utilize silver and avoid argyria, avoid the pitfalls of that argyria indicates, that we fail to use our silver, utilize our silver, to metabolize our silver. So now I know I have to vary where I put the contact points. And when you take a bath, it's pretty simple. You get immersed in the bath and it covers most, if not all of you, at one point or another. So you're contacting every point on the body. So there's not a condition of, oh, I got to vary where I put the contacts. But with this I do, because I have to leave them in a point for extended periods of time, because of the fact that it's lacking in amperage. It takes time for the mere presence of mild voltage to have its impact on the physiology. It takes time, just like it takes time to charge a battery. You can't do it instantaneously without wearing out the battery. So you have to give it time. Well, that's what this is. This is a charging condition, charging the body. You've put in your metallic material and your dielectric material, your silver and your beeswax. And now to charge the body, and because hydrogen peroxide is an alternative to this because it has a net charge of negative. So you're charging the silver with a negative charge. That's why hydrogen peroxide is an alternate to this. But in each case, I have to be in the bath for like 45 minutes minimum. An hour and a half is even better. And when I do sessions with this, I have to spend a good deal of time similar to a similar duration. So it doesn't matter whether you use this or hydrogen peroxide bath. One way or another, You got to charge the silver when it enters into the body. You just don't consume it and hope for the best, unless you think you've got a robust health. And that's why cayenne pepper has been so conventionally traditional, because it aggravates, it irritates the body to step up its voltage charge. But it pushes it using aggravation. Now this pushes it too. It pushes it with voltage, 1.5 volts. No current, just voltage. It's a different technique. So there you go. Cayenne pepper is another way. But I don't like spicy food. You know, there's a video on YouTube where this guy is talking with his friend. His friend turned him on to silver usage, colloidal silver, and then his friend is also selling fresh hot peppers. This is Australia, and they've got all these varieties of hot peppers. And the guy says, "Yes, I love this stuff." And he goes and he takes a fresh hot pepper and eats the whole thing on camera. I can't do that. So what they're doing is viable for them. So now we have 3 alternatives for charging the silver that we consume. If we can tolerate large quantity of cayenne pepper, then we can go that route. If we can't, then we have 2 alternates. We can take a bath in hydrogen peroxide or its variant, silver hydroperoxide with MSM and a mineral salt, which is a little more complicated, but it's more sophisticated and more beneficial than mere hydrogen peroxide alone. But in either case, it's food-grade hydrogen peroxide. Or we can make a depressed DC continuous circuit in which the amperage is depressed, but the voltage we leave alone. And we just use a AA battery. And then we put in however much resistance in series with the battery that we think is appropriate, what feels right. You know, Becker gives us hints. Picoamps, a couple hundred picoamps on the bottom range he's worked with before, and 1 or 2 microamps on the upper range, and nanoamps in between. So I started out using nanoamps. I started out with a AA battery using either 1, 10, or 100 megaohms of resistance. And he said 10 megaohms was the one he found most favorable. I don't know what the math works on a 1.5 volt battery, but it works out to a certain amperage that was his ideal amperage. I think it was something like 200 nanoamps. Well, I'm using 1,000 times less, because over time of continued use, see, he didn't do that. Emergency care for wound care is only so long as you have the wound, and once the wound is healed, you no longer use Becker's protocol. But I'm trying to treat a degenerating old age body, which means I need a protocol that I can keep up indefinitely, that's safe and effective. And that is probably why I went for the lower amperage of picoamps rather than nanoamps. And that might be why he got away with using nanoamps, because he didn't intend to keep it up beyond the healing of a few weeks or a few months at most of a wound. So these are all little factors we should take into consideration when we look at Becker and we look at what we're trying to do to replicate what Becker did. And they're noteworthy details. They make a difference between success and failure. And I keep finding more details that I've overlooked. So the devil is in the details, unfortunately, because you can lose interest very quickly and not know why. And blame it on the overall concept when it's no fault of the overall concept at all. Becker was a sincere man, he did sincere work, and he came up with very sincere results. But the devil is in the details, and if we don't honor that, then we have only ourselves to blame.